Welcome to part 2 of the construction of the triple leaping arches. In part 1 we did the physical construction of the arches, but now in part 2 we're going to tackle the electrical and software elements of the build. For this part I have put together a parts list. The 4 items listed at the top are essential, but the 4 lower items are optional, but I will explain the purpose of each. To achieve the animated effect, we're going to need a set of addressable LEDs. For this build, I have selected 5V strips with an IP65 rating to protect from moisture. However, we don't need to worry too much about water because they will be encased in the PEX tubing. I also selected strips with 60 LEDs per meter. A 5 meter strip will be enough to do a complete triple arch. Next, you're going to need a 5V power supply to power the LEDs and the controller. You will need to decide for yourself the current rating because it all depends on the amount of arches you'll be powering. If you were going to take the absolute maximum calculation, you would be looking at around 18 amps per triple arch. However, this is if you were running full white at full brightness on every LED. This is almost never the case. For my build, I have allocated around 9 amps per triple arch, and I will be limiting this in the controller so they will never draw more than that. In fact, WLED states that 6 amps will be enough for most effects for 300 LEDs. Next, we need a controller. The type of controller you use is entirely up to you, so if you already have something like a Falcon or Culp controller, then feel free to use that. I decided on a Node MCU with WLED installed for now because I wanted a solution that could run effects unattended without the need to run anything from a computer. However, it does have the flexibility that it can also be controlled by programs like X-Lights. The nice thing about this solution is you can quickly change effects via your mobile phone or computer. It is also completely wireless, so no need to run network cables. Obviously, you're going to need some suitable wiring. The gauge of the wire is down to you, but because I will be power injecting at multiple points and limiting the current in the controller, I will be using 18 AWG for the internal wiring of the arch. So now we move on to the level shifter. The reason for this is that the data input of the LEDs is 5V, but the Node MCU outputs 3.7. Now if your Node MCU is close to your LEDs, this is not a problem because the LEDs can still work at 3.7. However, if you are mounting the controller away from the arch, then you may have a problem due to voltage drop. My feeling is they are so cheap, so why not use them? The next item is also optional, and the arches will work perfectly fine without any fuses, but a set of fuses will add added protection if anything goes wrong. The capacitor is also optional, but the reason for it is to smooth out the power. When power supplies are switched on or current is drawn, you can get power spikes. These could have the potential to damage your LEDs. So once again, they are so cheap, why not use one? Then finally, we have an optional resistor. This will be connected just before the data line of your LEDs, and this will just add a little bit extra protection to your LEDs. So the next step is how we put all these components together. Here is a layout of how the components will be connected. So if we start with our 5V power supply, you can see we've put that capacitor there across the positive and the negative that will smooth out that power supply. Then we come along and we put that to V in and ground of our Node MCU that will power our controller. If we go to the top of the controller, we see D4, which is the data output pin that is going to send the signal to our LEDs. But we are passing that through the level shifter, so 3.7V goes in and 5V comes out. And then we're just putting power on both sides of that level shifter, 5V on the top side there and 3.3V on the bottom 2 pins. Then you can see now all of the power injection that we're doing on the LEDs. We've got the small, medium and large arch. So data passes in through the resistor into the data in of the large arch. It passes through the large arch, then goes to the medium arch, and then finally through the small arch. And you can see the approximate number of LEDs there, but that will be slightly different depending on your measurements. Then you can see we've got injection points on every arch there, and in fact there on the large arch I'm injecting on both sides of the arch. So now we're going to go through every single step that is needed to successfully flash your Node MCU with the WLED software that we're going to be using to control our leaping arches. So the piece of software that you will need is you're going to need this flashing tool. I'm using ESP Easy Flasher, but if you just search Google for Flash ESP8266, and I've already downloaded that. Then we're going to need a driver for our Node MCU, in my case the CP21000 driver. So this is the item we're going to download, and then we're going to need the latest version of the WLED, and we're going to be downloading this one for our 8266. If I go to the flashing tool first, okay, you can see it's given us just a folder here. So I'm just going to create a folder on my desktop, call it ESP Flash, and I'll copy the contents here. And while that's copying, we'll go back to our web browser, and I've got my WLED, so I'll copy that file to our new folder. So we have our firmware. Now all we need to do, we need to now connect, install the driver. So we'll go back to our browser. You see I've got the drivers here. I'll just show in folder. Just extract that. And now I will install the driver. And I've got 64-bit Windows, so I'm going to install that driver. So now I'm going to plug in my Node MCU and run the flashing tool. And you can see here it's found the Node MCU on COM port 3, and I will now choose the firmware, WLED and flash. You can see it's now connecting to the Node MCU and flashing the firmware. And there we go, flash complete. Once you have successfully flashed WLED to your Node MCU, you must then open your Wi-Fi settings and connect to the access point for the WLED using the password WLED1234. Then you would use the IP address 4.3.2.1, and that will connect you to WLED. At that point you need to do the Wi-Fi settings. I have already configured my Node MCU, so I'll show you. I will connect to it now. I set my IP address as 190. So now you see the WLED interface. When you log into it through the access point, you're going to be wanting to go to the Wi-Fi setup. And here is where you tell it which access point you want it to connect to and password. And then if you wish, you can set up a static IP address. I've also set a mini DNS name, but that's not needed. And then I've given it a name, in this case Arch01, so that if I'm looking at it on my network, I'll be able to see Arch01. Okay, so once you have made your changes, you can save that. It will reboot, and you can do as I did there, where I can connect to it through the IP address. Let's go back. And here is now where we set up our LED preferences. So if you're just using one node MCU to connect to one arch, to power one arch, you would change this to 300. Or however many LEDs it adds up to. It may be a few less depending when you fit your LEDs. But it's going to be around the 300 mark. And this is now where we set up the current limiter. So you can see it's saying if you were to power these completely full, the maximum feasible would be 17 amps. That's a little bit overkill because as you can see here, it says for most effects 6 amp is enough. But we couldn't just leave it at that because we could have a situation where we do go over that. So we need to put a limiter in place. So I'm going to be powering 2 arches. Okay. So I'm going to be doing around 600 LEDs, and it's saying 12 amp is roughly enough. But what I've done, I've set it to 18 amps, but that's for 2 arches. So now it will automatically limit the brightness, so it will keep the current within that area. We don't need to mess about. You can have a play with all these different settings, but when you're happy, you can just click save. Now, because we've got a triple arch set up, what you need to do is, if we come here, there is an element called segments. So if we look here, segment 1 is referring to all of our LEDs. So if I wanted to do my triple arches, I could add a segment and I could say, okay, it's actually 130 LEDs, and I've got the first segment. And then I can now say the next one is 100 LEDs, so it goes from up to 230. And then I could say the remaining one is another 70 LEDs. Okay. So 300, and you can see that's 1 arch. Obviously I would carry on because I'm powering 2 arches, so I would have control of those the second arch as well. Okay, so once you've done the segments, at that point, when you're doing an effect, you can actually apply an effect to multiple different arches with different effects on each arch. So if I wanted to just do my large arch, I could just select this segment, go to effects, and I could choose one of these effects. I'm not going to go into all of these effects. These are something for you to play around with. Okay. If I wanted it to affect all of my arches, so literally if I had a chasing effect that I wanted to pass right through all of the arches in question, I could set segment 0 and it would work across the 2 arches. But I think you get the idea there. So next we need to do, before we even go fitting our LEDs to our arches, we want to at least make sure everything is working. So you can see here I've got the node MCU. Now I've not included the capacitor and level shifter here, just for simplicity. But you can see here, just as the diagram showed, we've got our data coming out of there and coming along and actually passing into our LED strip here. And then we've got the 5 volts power coming to our node MCU. And it's as simple as that. And you can see now it's booted up, and it's just booted up in a solid colour. Now if we go to the computer and look at the interface, you can see at this point I will change the colour to red, and you can see the colour has changed to red, and these are just solid colours obviously. Okay. Now if you find that when you're changing between red to blue to green, if the colours are incorrect, what you need to do is go to the config, okay, and you can go to LED preferences, and if you look, there is an option here of the colour order. So you would just change that to if the green and red was incorrect, you would make it red, green, blue. Okay. But now let's just look at some of the effects. So if we come here, go back, we said we'd do some effects. So first let me make it so we just got segment 0, that's everything. So effects, and I can do something like, let's have a look, one that will, candy cane for instance. Okay, and you can see here we have a candy cane effect. Now within the application you can adjust the intensity and the speed, so if you make it much quicker, you can see if we come back it's a faster scroll. But we've got literally lots more. We've got chasing rainbow, all this type of thing. Okay, but like I said, there's no point me going into all of these settings, but you can see it's a nice simple setup. Obviously our next step is going to be to split this 5 meter strip into our 3 arch sizes and fit it into the arch. I must apologise for the state of my desk. Okay. So at this stage we have done everything we need to prepare ourselves for installing the LEDs into the arches themselves. So that will be in part 3. In part 3 you can see there we will cut all the strips to the appropriate size, install them into the arches and do all of the soldering and wiring and powering them up. So see you next time.